The Freddy Heineken Kidnapping. Section 1. The Planning. In the closing years of the 1970s, Amsterdam was a city in quiet transformation. The picturesque canals and bicycles, the cafes that lined its narrow streets, and the hum of conversations spilling from brown pubs, all of it painted a portrait of peace and prosperity. But beneath that surface charm, something else was stirring. A new generation of Dutch youth was growing restless. The post-war optimism that had filled their parents' lives seemed distant, replaced by frustration, ambition, and the desire to break free from the limitations of ordinary existence. Among those young men were Cor van Hout, Willem Holleder, Jan Bollard, Frans Meyer, and Martin Urkamps. They were not hardened criminals, not yet. They were friends, boys who had grown up in the same neighborhoods, who'd gone to the same schools, who'd spent their youth dreaming of wealth and freedom. They came from working-class families. Their lives were simple, their prospects modest. But they shared one trait that would unite them, a hunger for something bigger. It began, as many great and terrible ideas do, with a conversation, a half-serious thought, tossed around over beer and cigarettes. What if they could make one move, one bold act, that would secure them for life? No more scrimping, no more scraping by, no more envy of the powerful. The notion was ridiculous at first. But once an idea takes root in an ambitious mind, it rarely dies quietly. For Cor van Hout, the leader of the group, it became an obsession. Cor was clever, meticulous, and persuasive. He believed that with the right plan, the right timing, and absolute discipline, anything was possible. He was charismatic too, the kind of man people followed. Willem Holleder, his closest friend, was fiery, street-smart, and fiercely loyal. Where Cor calculated, Willem acted. Together they formed a dangerous balance, brains and audacity in equal measure. As the months passed, their idle talk turned into structure, and their structure into a plan. They considered banks, armoured cars, jewellery stores. But all those targets carried too many risks and too little reward. What they wanted was something that would yield a fortune, and perhaps more importantly, something that would shock the world. That was when Cor mentioned the name that would define the rest of their lives. Freddy Heineken. Freddy was more than a man. He was an institution. The grandson of the founder of Heineken breweries, he had turned a family business into a global empire. He was one of the wealthiest men in the Netherlands, but also one of its most visible. His face appeared in magazines, his name on billboards, his company's logo on bottles in every cafe in Amsterdam. To many, Freddy Heineken symbolized success itself. To Cor and Willem, he symbolized opportunity. The plan began to form slowly. What if they could kidnap Freddy Heineken, not for revenge, not out of hatred, but purely for ransom? What if they could hold him long enough, quietly enough, to demand a sum so large it would rewrite their futures? It was, at first, unimaginable. But the more they discussed it, the more it made sense. Freddy's wealth was liquid, his movements predictable, his security minimal. And in the early 1980s, the idea of kidnapping a corporate magnate was almost unheard of in the Netherlands. No one would expect it. The men began their research with patience. They followed Freddy discreetly, watching as his black BMW arrived at and departed from the Heineken headquarters on the Waitering Plantsoen. They took note of his driver, Ab Dodera, and his punctual routine. Freddy was a man of habit. He arrived at work around 10, lunched at the same time each day, and departed around 7 in the evening. There was comfort in his predictability, and vulnerability too. Over time, the group developed an elaborate schedule. They mapped escape routes, watched police patrols, and even measured the timing of stoplights along Freddy's route home. Every small detail mattered. They studied the flow of pedestrians, the visibility of street lamps, and the acoustics of alleyways. They were not improvising. They were orchestrating. Still, they knew that abducting such a prominent man required more than timing. They needed a place, somewhere secure, silent, and invisible to the outside world. They searched the industrial outskirts of Amsterdam until they found it, a warehouse in Amsterdam Noord, a neglected building tucked away between shipping yards and old factories. It was ideal, close enough to the city for quick access, but far enough to be forgotten. Inside, they began their grim work. They built 2 soundproof cells, small and oppressive. Each was lined with insulation and sealed with thick wooden panels. Metal chains were anchored to the walls. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling. A bucket would serve as a toilet. It was claustrophobic by design, secure, isolating and escape-proof. The men worked at night, using minimal light, always careful not to draw attention. Day by day, the warehouse transformed from a forgotten relic into a prison. Their tools were simple: saws, hammers, insulation, concrete. But behind every nail, behind every measurement, was intention. Every soundproof layer represented another layer of control. Every bolt in the door meant another assurance that no one would hear a cry for help. As construction continued, their bond deepened, and so did the illusion that what they were doing was justified. They convinced themselves that they weren't evil, merely ambitious. No one would be hurt, they told each other. They would feed their captives, keep them safe, release them when the money arrived. This was a business transaction, nothing more. To maintain secrecy, they spoke in code. They practiced shortwave radio communication and developed an emergency vocabulary known only to them. They changed their meeting spots frequently and avoided written notes. They paid for supplies in cash, used fake names and kept their circle tight. Trust was their greatest weapon and their greatest risk. By mid-1983, the preparations were nearly complete. The orange Ford Transit van, their chosen vehicle, had been modified with hidden panels and restraints. They had rehearsed dozens of times, timing how quickly they could move a man from car to van and from van to warehouse. They even simulated police chases, planning how to change license plates mid-journey. Each night they gathered, running through the plan again and again. They knew the dangers, but they also believed in their own brilliance. They believed that if they moved with precision, they could outsmart everyone, police, press, even the Heineken family itself. The mood among them grew intense. Some nights they laughed, imagining their futures with pockets full of money and new lives far away. Other nights, silence hung between them, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down. But Cor van Hout always broke that silence with the same words. "Remember," he said, "we're not killers. We're professionals. Freddy will live. We'll all live. We just need to do our job." Those words became a kind of prayer, a justification that softened their fear and their conscience. By early November 1983, everything was ready. The warehouse was complete. The van was prepared. The tools were packed. The men had memorized every second of the plan. On the night before the kidnapping, they met in silence. The air was heavy, the conversation minimal. Each man understood that tomorrow would change everything. There would be no going back, not to normal life, not to innocence, not to peace. And as the clock ticked closer to November 9th, 5 friends stood at the edge of history, still laughing, still loyal, still unaware that the plan they thought would make them rich would instead make them infamous. The world of ordinary life, the world of cafes and bicycles and easy laughter, was about to fade behind them. Ahead lay darkness, chains, and the sound of a door locking shut. The plan was no longer just an idea. It was about to become real. Section 2. The kidnapping. The night of November 9th moved with the steady inevitability of a city at rest. Amsterdam's avenues glowed under sodium lamps, tram rails hummed, and shutters closed one by one as ordinary citizens finished the day. In the Heineken offices on Wetteringplantsoon, a few lights lingered, lamps over desks where late paperwork still sat, the soft glow of monitors reflecting in polished wood. Freddy Heineken and his driver, Abdodera, left together as they often did. The evening was mild, the sky a washed quilt of clouds, and nothing in those final casual moments suggested the violence that would soon unfold. For the men who had planned the abduction, the city's calm was an ally. They had rehearsed the move so many times that the choreography had become muscle memory. The orange transit van was parked a short distance away, engine ticking as it cooled. The men wore dark clothing, gloves to hide fingerprints, masks to erase faces. Each step was quiet and practiced. They approached the car with the precision of technicians, not the swagger of criminals. They had measured time down to seconds and hoped their timing would hold. When the van pulled in beside Heineken's vehicle, the moment was striking in its ordinariness. An unremarkable street, an unremarkable van. Then, with sudden speed, men emerged, voices curt and mechanical. The shock of guns, visible, pointed, produced an immediate compliance. There was no cinematic struggle, no tangle of shouting figures, rather a rapid efficiency that left little room for resistance. Heineken and Dodera were grabbed, guided, and forced into the van. The kidnappers taped motorcycle helmets over their heads, dimming sight and sound, ensuring the captives could not identify routes or faces. It was a tactic of erasure, to remove anchors of perception so that escape would be near impossible. Inside the van, the world contracted. Heineken felt the unnatural compression of the helmets, the muffled breathing of his companion, the smell of damp cloth. He had always been a man of control. Boardrooms, contracts, negotiations, but now control had been stripped away. He had to rely on memory and intuition, on fragments of sound and movement. He counted turns, listened for engine notes, tried to map distance by changes in speed. The kidnappers spoke in clipped commands and measured tones, as if reminding themselves that speed and silence were their greatest protections. The route to Amsterdam Nord was chosen for its anonymity. The industrial districts there had fewer pedestrians at night, long access roads, and the maze of loading bays made surveillance complicated. The van took side streets, then a narrow service road, and finally pulled up behind a warehouse whose windows were dark and whose facade had the anonymity of so many industrial structures. The men moved with the practiced urgency of a group who believed in the infallibility of their plan. They produced keys, opened doors, and guided the captives into the soundproof cells that had been built for precisely this purpose. The cells were small and deliberately disorienting. Insulation blunted sound, the air tasted stale. Chains were attached to sturdy anchors in the wall. The kidnappers fastened restraints with methodical care and spoke in business-like tones. The captivity was not designed to punish with brutality, but to enforce compliance. Food was provided in small, monitored portions. The captors kept contact minimal, employing a strategy of control that combined deprivation of sensory cues with routine, which can be a cruelly effective tool for breaking morale. When the van pulled away and the night reasserted its calm, the city itself remained largely unaware of what had occurred in its shadowed streets. The disappearance of Freddy Heineken, however, could not remain secret for long. By the time his absence was noted and calls began to ripple through offices and family homes, the story had already started to spread. The Heineken Company, the family, and the police coordinated quickly. Reports moved from confusion to urgency as alarms were raised and a full-scale investigation began. In those early hours, the kidnappers felt the euphoria of a successful execution, tempered by the paranoia that follows high-risk acts. They dispersed from the scene with practiced efficiency, believing their preparation secure. For Heineken and Dodera, those first hours would become a foreshortened lifetime. A sliver of time in which reality and fear were compressed into a single experience that would echo long after the helmets came off and the chains were unlocked. The city of Amsterdam awoke to the news with a blend of shock and curiosity. Newspapers that morning bore the headline of the extraordinary event, a high-profile abduction that had succeeded where many other attempts might have failed. Journalists began to probe the motives and methods. Citizens speculated about motives. Law enforcement stepped into action, combing for the smallest hint that could lead back to the warehouse in Amsterdam Noord. The stage was set for a negotiation that would test the limits of secrecy, loyalty, and the public's appetite for mercy and justice. Section 3. The Captivity. The warehouse door slammed shut with a hollow clang that echoed into silence. For Freddy Heineken and his driver, Ab Dodera, the world they knew, the comfort of their daily routines, the assurance of safety, was gone in an instant. In its place came darkness, damp air, and the smell of rust and dust, thick with the claustrophobic tension of confinement. The two men were taken to separate cells, narrow compartments that had once been storage closets. Each cell was roughly 2 meters long and barely wide enough for a man to lie down. The walls were lined with soundproof insulation, the kind used in recording studios. Every trace of the outside world was sealed away. No wind, no light, not even the faint hum of the city. It was as though they had been buried alive. Chains clinked against concrete as the kidnappers secured their captives. Their movements were brisk, practiced. No words of comfort, no explanations. Each man wore a balaclava, their voices muffled and their gestures mechanical. They left behind a small crate of supplies, a thin mattress, a few blankets, and a bucket for sanitation. For food, they would bring bread, cheese, and the occasional cup of soup. Never enough to satisfy, but enough to survive. Days blurred into nights, though Heineken could no longer tell one from the other. Time lost meaning in the dark. He tried to keep track by marking scratches in the wall, counting meals and estimating hours between visits. But the kidnappers were irregular, sometimes arriving twice a day, sometimes not for what felt like days. Isolation began to wear on the mind. The soundproofing that had been designed to keep the world out also kept their sanity trapped within. Heineken, a man known for his meticulous control and sharp intellect, now faced a different challenge: survival without information. He could not negotiate. He could not predict. He could only endure. He tried to speak to Ab Dodera through the wall, tapping with his chains or whispering faintly. But most of the time there was only silence. In those long hours, memories filled the void. He thought about his childhood in Amsterdam, about his grandfather Gerard Adrian Heineken, who had founded the brewery in the 19th century. He recalled the pride of walking through the company's headquarters, seeing his family name glowing in gold letters on every bottle. Now that name was his only link to the world outside, a world that was surely searching for him. Heineken's mind, ever analytical, tried to understand his captors. They were not professionals, he sensed. Their methods were too improvised, too human. When they spoke among themselves, he could hear traces of nervousness beneath their composure. One of them, he thought, seemed almost reluctant. His hands trembled when unlocking the chains. Another had a commanding voice, clipped and confident, the tone of someone used to giving orders. Heineken filed away every detail, hoping that if he ever escaped, those memories might help identify them. For the kidnappers, these days were also filled with tension. Holding two hostages required discipline and secrecy. The warehouse had to remain quiet, unvisited, and unremarkable. Every sound risked exposure. They took turns standing guard and sleeping in shifts, listening for police sirens that never came. At night, when the city lights flickered faintly through the cracks of the boarded windows, even they began to feel the weight of what they had done. What had seemed like a bold, thrilling plan was becoming a test of endurance and conscience. Back in the cells, Heineken fought despair by constructing mental routines. He replayed business meetings in his head, imagined conversations with his wife Lucille, and silently composed letters he might never send. He forced himself to exercise in the tiny space, push-ups, stretching anything to keep his body from giving in. But the darkness crept inward. He sometimes hallucinated faint glimmers of light or thought he heard voices beyond the wall. Sleep brought no relief. Dreams and reality intertwined. Abdodera in the next cell suffered quietly. He had been loyal to Heineken for years, more companion than employee. He worried less for himself than for his employer, whose age and health could not endure such conditions indefinitely. He prayed softly, whispering in the dark, "We'll get out. They'll find us." But even hope began to erode as days stretched into weeks. Outside, Amsterdam continued as usual. Bicycles on the canals, trams rumbling through Dam Square. Yet an unease had settled over the city. The disappearance of Freddy Heineken, one of the Netherlands' most recognizable figures, dominated every headline. Police scoured the city, searching warehouses, interviewing witnesses, and following faint leads. But the kidnappers had chosen well. The industrial zones of Amsterdam Noord were full of empty buildings, each one resembling the next. The warehouse that held the captives was hidden in plain sight. As the third week approached, Heineken's body began to weaken. His beard grew thick, his voice hoarse from disuse. He wrote imaginary letters to his wife in his mind, apologizing for putting her through this. He wondered whether the company could survive without him, whether the kidnappers would actually keep their word. He suspected the ransom demand must have been enormous, but how much was a man's freedom worth? How much was his name worth? And yet, beneath his exhaustion, there remained a sliver of pride. He was Freddy Heineken, heir to a dynasty that had survived wars and economic crashes. If he had built an empire from hops and barley, surely he could survive 4 walls and chains. He repeated this to himself each night like a prayer. They will not break me. I will outlast them. Unknown to him, the negotiations outside had already begun. And while he waited in darkness, the story that would soon captivate the world was quietly gathering momentum. Section 4. The Ransom and Negotiations. Outside the silent walls of the warehouse, Amsterdam was in turmoil. News of Freddy Heineken's disappearance spread rapidly through the Netherlands, moving from whispers in cafes to bold headlines on every newspaper. By the second morning, the story was front-page news. Heineken missing, police suspect kidnapping. It was a shock that rippled across the country. The name Heineken was not just a brand. It was a symbol of Dutch pride, prosperity, and tradition. To imagine that man in chains was unthinkable. At the Heineken headquarters, chaos met disbelief. Executives and family members crowded into conference rooms, fielding calls from journalists and law enforcement. Heineken's wife, Lucille, composed but pale, faced a stream of police investigators and reporters demanding statements. She said little, only that she trusted the authorities and hoped for her husband's safe return. Behind closed doors, however, the family began to prepare for what they feared most, a ransom demand. The kidnappers, meanwhile, were under their own kind of pressure. Holding 2 men in captivity was risky enough. Now, with every police car and helicopter combing Amsterdam, every movement carried the threat of exposure. But Cor van Hout and Willem Holleder were determined to maintain control. They had spent 2 years planning this moment, and now precision was everything. The first step was communication. 3 days after the kidnapping, the Heineken company received a letter. It was handwritten, the words deliberately spaced, the tone almost polite. It confirmed that both Freddy Heineken and Ab Dodera were alive and demanded a ransom of 35 million Dutch guilders, the equivalent of nearly 15 million USD at the time. It was, by any standard, an astronomical sum, the largest ransom ever demanded in Europe. Payment was to be made in small, unmarked banknotes, packaged in a specific way, and delivered according to detailed instructions that would follow. For the kidnappers, the choice of amount was deliberate. They knew Heineken could pay. They knew the company and his family would do anything to ensure his safety. But they also wanted to make a statement, an act so bold that it would place them in criminal legend. To them, 35 million guilders was not just money. It was proof of their own audacity. The Dutch police, led by seasoned investigator Piet Mentz, immediately established a task force. They tapped phones, analysed the ransom letters, and tried to identify handwriting or linguistic patterns. But the kidnappers were careful. Their communications were routed through intermediaries, letters left in public places, and messages coded to confuse potential surveillance. Every word had been rehearsed in advance. At police headquarters, debate raged. Should the family pay, risking that the kidnappers might vanish with the money and never release the hostages? Or should they refuse, forcing the abductors to make a mistake that could reveal their location? The Heineken family's position was clear. They would pay whatever it took. But Dutch law enforcement had seen too many cases where ransom payments ended in tragedy. Behind the scenes, private advisors and company lawyers began to coordinate discreetly with trusted intermediaries, men who could deliver messages without attracting suspicion. The process moved cautiously, every step reviewed by the police. Yet each passing day increased the danger for the hostages. Heineken's health, they knew, could not withstand weeks in confinement. Meanwhile, the kidnappers drafted a second message, this one longer, almost businesslike in tone. It contained proof of life, details only Heineken could have supplied. The words were accompanied by a Polaroid photograph. Freddy Heineken sitting in his cell, eyes hollow, a paper sign with the date hanging from his neck. For his family, the image was devastating confirmation. For the world, it became one of the most haunting images of the decade. Police carefully analysed the photo. Experts studied the lighting, the shadows, the grain of the paper. Was it daylight? Artificial light? Could the reflection in Heineken's eyes reveal a clue about the room? The search widened to every warehouse and industrial district in Amsterdam, with officers working around the clock. But there were thousands of buildings, many abandoned, many identical. The kidnappers' caution had paid off. Inside the warehouse, Heineken sensed that negotiations were underway. The kidnappers grew more agitated, whispering more frequently, their visits shorter. One of them, perhaps nervous, muttered that the police are everywhere. Heineken heard this and knew it could only mean one thing. The ransom was being discussed. He felt relief mixed with dread. If the authorities intervened too soon, his life and Dodera's could be in jeopardy. After more than 2 weeks of tense back and forth, a plan for the ransom drop was set. It was as elaborate as the kidnapping itself. The money was to be placed in 21 metal containers, each containing bundles of 100 guilder notes, and transported to a designated location north of Amsterdam. The instructions specified that no police surveillance was to be present. Any sign of a trap, the kidnappers warned, would result in the deaths of both hostages. To ensure obedience, they included another chilling message. "We are watching you." The police faced an impossible dilemma. They had to track the money without alerting the kidnappers. Technicians debated how to conceal miniature transmitters among the bills, but the volume of cash, hundreds of kilograms in total, made that impractical. In the end, they opted for surveillance teams positioned far from the drop site, relying on unmarked vehicles and night vision binoculars. As the night of the ransom drop approached, tension hung over the city like fog. Every participant knew that one wrong move could shatter the fragile balance. At the last moment, however, the exchange failed. The kidnappers spotted what they believed to be a police presence and aborted the pickup. The containers were left untouched. Hours later, police retrieved the money, frustrated but relieved that the hostages might still be alive. For Heineken and Dodera, the failed ransom meant only more uncertainty. They could sense the kidnappers' growing anxiety. Their captors argued, voices rising, sometimes shouting. At one point, Heineken thought he heard one of them say, "We'll have to move them." The idea terrified him. Movement meant exposure, but it also meant risk, an opportunity for violence or worse. Days turned into weeks. The kidnappers tried again to arrange the exchange, sending new instructions, altering meeting points, shifting times. The police followed each lead meticulously, always one step behind. The Heineken family, caught between hope and despair, continued to cooperate but grew increasingly desperate. Every sunrise felt heavier than the last. Finally, near the end of November, a breakthrough came, not from negotiation, but from investigation. Police had begun tracing the network of vehicles connected to known associates of Cor van Hout and Willem Holleder. A tip led them to a warehouse in Amsterdam Noord, one of dozens, but something about it caught attention. The rent was paid in cash, under a false name. Surveillance began quietly, without alerting the media. Inside that warehouse, Heineken lay awake, unaware that rescue was approaching. The kidnappers were restless, their confidence fraying. They debated whether to flee, to abandon the hostages, to cut their losses. But Van Hout insisted they hold steady. "We've come too far to run now." It was a fatal miscalculation. Section 5. The Discovery and Rescue. By the end of November 1983, the investigation had reached a fever pitch. More than 100 police officers were involved, working shifts around the clock, scouring every warehouse, garage and industrial unit within a 50-kilometre radius of Amsterdam. The search was methodical, exhausting, and filled with frustration. Each new lead brought a flicker of hope, then another dead end. For many, it seemed as though Freddy Heineken and Ab Dodera had simply vanished, but a faint thread was beginning to emerge. Among the countless warehouses checked, one property in Amsterdam Noord stood out. The rent was paid in cash under a false name. No activity had been registered there for weeks. And yet, neighbours occasionally heard noises late at night, metallic sounds as if chains were dragging across concrete. At first, these noises were dismissed as construction or storage work, but when investigators matched the rental records to a known associate of Cor van Hout, the pattern began to sharpen. Police surveillance of the area intensified. Officers were instructed to remain invisible. No uniforms, no marked cars, only quiet observation from a distance. They watched for days. At first, nothing moved. Then, on the evening of November 29th, a small orange van, the same model described by witnesses from the night of the kidnapping, was seen parked briefly near the warehouse before disappearing into the darkness. That was enough. The next morning, the decision was made. A raid would take place. The raid team assembled quietly before dawn on November 30th, 1983. It was cold, the kind of damp November chill that clings to every surface. As the convoy of unmarked cars rolled into the industrial district, the city was still asleep. The operation was led by Inspector Piet Mens himself, who had spent the last 3 weeks living on black coffee and adrenaline. He knew that the success of this mission depended on precision and silence. At 8:30 a.m., officers surrounded the building. There was no movement inside, no sound at all. They pried open the heavy metal door, stepping into the darkness, their flashlights cutting through the stale air. The smell hit them first, a mix of damp concrete, rust, and human confinement. Then came the sound, a faint rhythmic noise, metallic, deliberate. It was the unmistakable clinking of chains. When the first cell door opened, the beam of light revealed a sight that would stay with the rescuers for the rest of their lives. There, sitting on a thin mattress, was Freddy Heineken. His face was pale, his eyes hollow but alert. For a moment he didn't move. He stared at the men in front of him, unsure if this was real or another cruel trick. Only when one of the officers whispered, "Meneer Heineken, we're from the police," did he exhale and nod weakly. In the adjoining cell they found Ab Dodera. He was thinner, visibly exhausted but alive. Both men had been chained by the wrists to the walls of their tiny compartments, barely 2 meters by 1. There was no light, no window, and almost no ventilation. The walls had been covered with layers of insulation and thick soundproofing foam. Even if Heineken had screamed, no one outside could have heard him. Medical personnel rushed in, assessing their condition. They were dehydrated, undernourished, and mentally drained, but remarkably composed. Heineken asked for water and, to everyone's astonishment, inquired calmly about his driver's condition before accepting help himself. It was an extraordinary display of composure after 3 weeks in near-total darkness. Outside the warehouse, word of the rescue spread quickly through police channels. Within minutes, journalists began to gather, though the details were tightly controlled. The Dutch public woke to breaking news bulletins. Freddy Heineken, found alive. The sense of relief that swept across the Netherlands that morning was profound. After 21 days of uncertainty, the nation's most famous industrialist was safe, but the case was far from over. The kidnappers themselves had vanished. Inside the warehouse, police found clear evidence of the crime: chains, food containers, notebooks, but no trace of Cor van Hout or Willem Holleder. They had fled, likely alerted by rumours that the police were closing in. Still, the evidence left behind was overwhelming. Fingerprints, handwriting samples, and vehicle registrations tied the operation to the small group of childhood friends who had orchestrated the abduction. As Heineken was transported to safety, he sat quietly in the back of a police car, wrapped in a blanket. He spoke little, but when asked if he had known his captors, he said simply, "No, but I will never forget their voices." That night, doctors examined him at a private clinic under heavy security. He was physically weak, but mentally alert. When questioned about his ordeal, he provided precise details: the layout of the warehouse, the number of captors, their accents, even the rhythm of their footsteps. His memory was meticulous, almost unnervingly so. Meanwhile, the rescue team remained on site for hours, cataloguing every piece of evidence. The soundproof chambers were photographed extensively. Investigators noted the extraordinary care taken in their construction: thick metal doors, multiple locks, hidden ventilation shafts. It was clear that the kidnappers had planned every detail with cold, technical precision. Back at police headquarters, the atmosphere was both triumphant and tense. Yes, Heineken had been found alive, but the men responsible were still at large, and 35 million guilders were still missing. The manhunt that followed would become one of the largest in Dutch history. In the days that followed, as Heineken slowly recovered, the press descended upon Amsterdam. Reporters from across Europe and beyond filled the city's hotels, broadcasting every new development. Cameras waited outside police stations, eager for any glimpse of progress. The Heineken family released a brief statement thanking the authorities and the public for their support, requesting privacy for Freddy as he recuperated. Behind the scenes, however, the patriarch of the Heineken empire was already meeting quietly with investigators, determined to ensure that justice would be done. The discovery of the warehouse marked a turning point. From that moment, the investigation shifted from rescue to relentless pursuit. The evidence was irrefutable, the suspects identified. Now it was a race against time to catch them before they vanished abroad. Section 6. The Aftermath and Arrests. The rescue of Freddy Heineken and Abdodera marked not the end of the story, but the beginning of one of the most exhaustive manhunts in Dutch history. For weeks, the media had followed every rumour, every whisper. Now, with Heineken safe, attention turned to the question on everyone's mind: who were the men bold enough to kidnap the most powerful businessman in the Netherlands? In the hours following the rescue, detectives sifted through the evidence collected at the warehouse. There were fingerprints, scraps of paper with coded notes, and remnants of meals hastily eaten. The orange transport van, found abandoned nearby, contained a few cigarette butts and a single map of Amsterdam marked with faint pencil lines, possible routes used during the abduction. Every clue was examined, photographed, and logged. The team worked in silence, the weight of the case pressing on each of them. Within 24 hours, investigators had connected the dots. Names began to surface: Cor van Hout, Willem Holleder, Frans Meyer, Jan Burlard, and Martin Erkamps, a group of lifelong friends from Amsterdam's working-class neighbourhoods. They had grown up together, shared ambitions, and drifted gradually from petty crimes into more elaborate schemes. The Heineken kidnapping, as it turned out, was their masterpiece: 2 years of planning, endless rehearsals, and the arrogance of believing they could outwit the entire Dutch police force. When news of the suspects' identities reached the press, the public's reaction was one of disbelief. These were not hardened international terrorists or shadowy professional mercenaries. They were ordinary men in their early 30s, raised in the same streets as many of their neighbours. That realization shocked the nation even more than the crime itself. The search expanded rapidly. Interpol was alerted. Airports and border crossings were placed on high alert. Raids were conducted across Amsterdam and Utrecht, though the prime suspects had already fled. Cor van Hout and Willem Holleder were believed to have escaped the country within days of the rescue, using forged passports and false identities. Police followed trails that led through Belgium, France, and eventually to Spain. Meanwhile, Heineken remained under police protection. Despite his calm public demeanour, those close to him noticed the lasting effects of captivity. He slept little, avoided crowds, and often asked for blinds to remain partially open. He could no longer bear complete darkness, yet he also demonstrated extraordinary resolve. In interviews he spoke clearly, almost clinically, about his ordeal, insisting that justice would prevail not through vengeance, but through the proper rule of law. It was this composure that further strengthened public admiration for him. Weeks passed before a breakthrough came. A French customs officer near Paris reported a suspicious vehicle parked overnight at a rural rest stop. The plates matched a car linked to the fugitives. Within hours, French police moved in, surrounding a small cottage outside Parthenay. Inside, they found Cor van Hout and Willem Holleder, exhausted and armed but caught off guard. They surrendered without resistance. The arrest was swift, almost anticlimactic, considering the scale of their crime. Dutch authorities immediately requested extradition. The process, however, was far from simple. France's legal system required a detailed review of the charges, and the kidnappers' defense lawyers argued that the conditions of Dutch prisons would violate their clients' human rights. The irony was not lost on the public. 2 men who had kept another human being chained in darkness now sought mercy from the law. Back in Amsterdam, the remaining accomplices were rounded up one by one. Jan Burlard was captured after a tense standoff in a farmhouse outside Utrecht. Martin Erkamps was arrested attempting to withdraw cash from a bank under an assumed name. The last to be found was Frans Meyer, who vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but rumours. For months, he remained one of the most wanted men in Europe. Then, in 1984, he resurfaced, in Paraguay of all places. Local journalists, tipped off by Dutch reporters and led by the relentless crime investigator Peter R. de Vries, tracked him down to a remote village. The arrest, filmed by de Vries's camera crew, would later become one of the defining moments of Dutch investigative journalism. By the time Meyer was extradited back to the Netherlands, public opinion had hardened. The country, still reeling from the kidnapping, demanded accountability. The case had not only exposed flaws in Dutch security, but had also forced the nation to confront the unsettling fact that its most audacious criminals had come from within its own neighbourhoods. For law enforcement, the arrests brought both relief and reflection. The operation had been a national ordeal, 3 weeks of uncertainty, then months of pursuit, Officers who had been on the case since day one described it as the most intense experience of their careers. The lessons learned would later shape Dutch policing methods for years to come. Improved communication between regional departments, stricter monitoring of rented industrial properties, and new policies for handling ransom situations. For Freddy Heineken, however, justice was only part of the healing process. In interviews after the arrests, he spoke with measured detachment about his captors. They were young, he said once, but they were not fools. They planned everything. They thought they were playing a game, but it was not a game. It was life and death. His words carried no anger, only an unmistakable weight. He had seen the limits of human greed and the resilience of his own will. The Dutch press dubbed the kidnappers the Amsterdam Five, though the name carried a strange sense of notoriety, even fascination. Books were written, documentaries produced, and debates raged over how ordinary men could justify such extraordinary cruelty. In the cafes and living rooms of Amsterdam, people argued whether the ransom demand had been driven by desperation, ideology, or pure arrogance. Most concluded it was greed, and perhaps in equal measure, the thrill of defying the system. By the end of 1984, with all major suspects in custody, the stage was set for one of the most publicized trials in Dutch legal history. The nation had witnessed the crime, the fear, and the pursuit. Now, it would watch the reckoning. Section 7. The Trial and Sentencing. By the spring of 1985, the Netherlands was preparing for what would become one of the most closely watched trials in its modern history. The courtroom in Amsterdam's Palace of Justice stood ready, polished floors, rows of journalists, and a line of uniformed officers posted along the walls. Every seat was filled. The atmosphere was heavy, not with excitement, but with anticipation. The nation that had followed every stage of the Heineken case now waited for its legal conclusion. The defendants, Cor van Hout, Willem Holleder, Jan Berlard, Frans Meyer and Martin Erkamps, entered the courtroom under heavy guard. Gone were the defiant smiles and the swagger that had marked their early days of notoriety. Now, in the glare of the cameras, they looked smaller, their youth dimmed by months in confinement. The public saw not masterminds but men, tired, pale and subdued. Yet the tension that filled the room was undeniable. For the Heineken family, it was the moment of reckoning they had waited for since that cold night in November 1983. The prosecution's case was monumental. Stacks of evidence filled the courtroom. Photographs of the soundproof cells, blueprints of the warehouse, transcripts of ransom letters, and hundreds of forensic exhibits. Prosecutor Gerard Hoekstra, a meticulous and composed man, began by recounting the chain of events with surgical precision. He spoke calmly, without theatrics, allowing the facts themselves to convey the enormity of the crime. The defendants, he said, did not act out of desperation or ideology. They acted out of greed and out of the belief that they were untouchable. Over the following weeks, the courtroom became a stage for the most detailed reconstruction of the kidnapping ever heard. Police officers testified about the raid, describing the soundproof cells and the emotional moment of discovery. Experts explained how the kidnappers had modified the warehouse, right down to the thickness of the insulation and the type of chains used. Each testimony built a meticulous portrait of calculation, cold, deliberate, and without remorse. The defense, led by a team of seasoned lawyers, attempted to challenge the narrative. They argued that their clients had not intended physical harm, that the captives had been fed, and that Heineken had been found alive and unharmed. It was a legal strategy that many found distasteful, bordering on absurd. The public saw through it immediately. The idea that the kidnappers' restraint should count in their favour seemed an insult to the suffering endured by the victims. Freddy Heineken himself did not attend most of the proceedings. He appeared once, briefly and under tight security, to give testimony. The courtroom fell silent when he entered. He walked slowly, dignified, a faint trace of the ordeal still visible in his posture. When he spoke, his voice was calm and deliberate. He described the 21 days of captivity, the damp air, the endless darkness, the echo of his own heartbeat. He spoke not with hatred, but with clarity. "They took my freedom," he said, "and they tried to take my dignity, but they failed in both." His words lingered long after he left the stand. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy grew. Television crews from across Europe broadcast live updates. Newspapers ran daily summaries, analyzing every witness and legal maneuver. The Heineken trial became not just a legal event, but a cultural one. It forced the Dutch public to confront questions about morality, justice, and the nature of punishment. Were these men evil or simply reckless? Could a crime of such scale ever be atoned for? Throughout the proceedings, the 5 defendants maintained varying degrees of cooperation. Cor van Hout remained defiant, at times smirking as witnesses spoke. Willem Holleder, quieter, but still confident, often whispered with his lawyers. Frans Meyer seemed more nervous, frequently looking toward the floor, his hands trembling. Berlard and Erkamps stayed almost completely silent. Each had their own story, their own rationalization, but all shared one undeniable truth. They had participated willingly in a crime that shocked a nation. The prosecution's closing arguments were measured but firm. Hoekstra reminded the court of the careful planning, the rented warehouse, the forged keys, the soundproof chambers designed to erase human voices. These men, he said, did not act on impulse. They built a prison within a city, and they did so believing they would never be caught. He paused, letting the silence fill the room. Society cannot permit such arrogance to go unpunished. After months of testimony and deliberation, the verdicts were finally delivered. All 5 men were found guilty of kidnapping, unlawful detention, and extortion. The sentences were among the heaviest ever issued in the Netherlands for a crime of that nature. Cor van Hout and Willem Holleder received 11 years each. Frans Meyer, Jan Berlard, and Martin Erkamps received 8 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement. The courtroom erupted, not with applause, but with a collective exhale. Justice, at least in legal terms, had been done. For the Heineken family, the moment was bittersweet. The guilty verdicts provided closure, but not peace. Freddy Heineken's daughter, Charlene, later remarked that the ordeal had left a shadow that would follow the family for years. The trauma of those weeks could not be undone by prison sentences, yet there was also gratitude, a recognition that the system had held firm, that law and order had prevailed over chaos. As the convicted men were led away, reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. The kidnappers' faces remained expressionless. For them, the story was far from over. Appeals would follow, prison terms would be served, and in later years, some, most notably Willem Holleder, would re-emerge in the headlines under even darker circumstances. But that was a story still to come. At the time, the Heineken case stood as a warning. It revealed the vulnerabilities of wealth and power, but also the resilience of justice. It reminded the Netherlands that even in a nation known for its civility and order, the line between law and lawlessness could be crossed by anyone, given motive and opportunity. When the trial concluded, there was a strange quiet across Amsterdam. The city that had once been filled with fear now seemed reflective. In cafes and living rooms, people discussed not only the crime, but what it said about society itself. How could men from ordinary neighborhoods have carried out something so cold and calculated? Some saw it as a failure of morality, others as a symptom of greed and envy. Whatever the explanation, the lesson was clear. No one, not even a titan of industry, was beyond reach, and no crime was beyond consequence. As for Freddy Heineken, he returned to his work in the following months, though he was never quite the same. He took fewer public appearances, travelled discreetly, and surrounded himself with new layers of security. In interviews years later, he would say that he had learned one thing above all. Freedom, he said softly, is the only luxury that cannot be bought. Section 8. The Legacy. The Heineken kidnapping left deep marks not only on the lives of those directly involved, but on Dutch society as a whole. It became more than a crime story. It became a mirror through which the Netherlands examined itself. In a nation long regarded for its orderliness, restraint, and sense of safety, the abduction of a national icon shattered an illusion. If Freddy Heineken, one of the most powerful and well-protected men in the country, could be taken from the street, then perhaps no one was truly safe. In the years that followed, conversations about security changed. Private protection for executives, once considered unnecessary and even ostentatious, became commonplace. Corporations began to employ professional risk consultants, install surveillance systems, and require security drivers for senior figures. Banks revised protocols for ransom transactions, and insurance companies quietly began offering new forms of coverage, kidnap and ransom insurance. It was a quiet revolution in Dutch business culture, born directly out of fear. For law enforcement, the case served as a catalyst for modernization. The Dutch police, known for their relatively relaxed and community-based methods, realized that they needed stronger coordination across regions. Task forces were restructured, forensic technologies improved, and communication with international agencies, particularly Interpol, was streamlined. Future high-profile investigations would move faster and more cohesively because of lessons learned from the Heineken case. The media, too, underwent a transformation. Journalists who had covered the kidnapping often spoke later of the moral tightrope they had walked, balancing the public's right to know against the danger of revealing information that might jeopardize lives. The case set a precedent for how the Dutch press would handle sensitive stories in the future, with restraint, but also with unflinching curiosity. And then there was the cultural aftermath, the stories, the books, the films. In the years that followed, the kidnapping inspired documentaries, novels, and several dramatized adaptations. Each retelling added its own interpretation, some focusing on the psychology of the kidnappers, others on Heineken's resilience. One film, The Heineken Kidnapping, released decades later, reignited public debate about how accurately art should portray real suffering. For many Dutch citizens, it reopened old wounds. For younger generations, it was a chance to rediscover a story that had defined an era. Freddy Heineken himself remained a figure of fascination. To the public, he was both a symbol of survival and a reminder of vulnerability. In interviews after his recovery, he maintained a careful balance between openness and reserve. He spoke little of the fear, preferring instead to emphasize the professionalism of the police and the courage of his family. Privately, those close to him said the experience had changed him profoundly. He became more introspective, more protective of his privacy. He rarely walked anywhere without security again, and his offices were redesigned with hidden alarms and reinforced doors. Heineken, once known for his confidence and charisma, became quieter, his humour edged with caution. Yet the ordeal also strengthened certain aspects of his character. He returned to work with renewed determination, overseeing the company's continued global expansion. In a sense, he reclaimed control of his life through his business. When asked years later how he had managed to endure his captivity, he replied, "When you have nothing left to control, you must control your thoughts. That is where freedom begins." It was a statement that encapsulated both his pragmatism and his extraordinary mental resilience. The kidnapper's legacy was far different. For a brief moment, their names became infamous, a dark legend in Dutch criminal history. But as years passed, their notoriety curdled into infamy. Several of them, after completing their prison sentences, struggled to reintegrate into society. Cor van Hout continued a life in the criminal world and was ultimately murdered in 2003 in a gangland shooting. Willem Holleder, once seen as the brash, charming mastermind, later became one of the Netherlands' most notorious crime figures, accused of ordering multiple murders. He would eventually be sentenced to life imprisonment in 2019. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very crime that had made him famous also set him on a path that would define his destruction. In contrast, Freddy Heineken's legacy endured not through tragedy, but through endurance. He lived another 2 decades, guiding his company through new markets and technological change. When he passed away in 2002, tributes poured in from across the world, not just from business leaders, but from ordinary Dutch citizens who remembered the fear and relief that had surrounded his name in 1983. He had survived something that few could imagine, and he had done so with composure, intelligence, and a touch of humour. His survival became part of the Dutch national narrative, a reminder that resilience and dignity could outlast cruelty and greed. The Heineken kidnapping also reshaped the Dutch perception of crime itself. Until then, the Netherlands had seen itself as largely immune to the kind of organised, calculated criminality that plagued larger nations. The case forced the public to confront a new reality, that wealth, opportunity, and global visibility came with risk. It was, in a sense, the end of innocence for a small, proud nation. By the end of the 1980s, the Heineken case was being studied in law schools and police academies as a model of both criminal sophistication and investigative persistence. To younger generations of officers, it was a story about vigilance and perseverance. To sociologists, it was a case study in how class resentment, greed, and opportunity could intertwine to create tragedy. To ordinary citizens, it remained a haunting story, proof that no matter how familiar the streets of Amsterdam might seem, darkness could still hide behind any corner. Section 9. Closing Reflections. As the decades passed, the kidnapping of Freddy Heineken became more than a historical event. It became a symbol, a touchstone in the collective memory of the Netherlands. Nearly everyone alive in 1983 could remember where they were when they heard the news of his disappearance, and where they were when they learned he had been found. It was one of those moments that divided time, a before and an after. Listening to the story today, we can trace its rhythm like the movement of a pendulum, from careful planning to violent execution, to patient investigation, to ultimate justice. It is, at its core, a story about human extremes, greed and endurance, arrogance and discipline, captivity and freedom. It reminds us that even the most calculated crimes are still deeply human acts, driven by the same flaws and desires that run through every life. For the kidnappers, the Heineken case began as a quest for fortune and power. They imagined themselves as clever outlaws, outsmarting the system. But their arrogance blinded them. They underestimated not only the reach of law enforcement, but the resilience of the man they sought to break. In their attempt to assert control, they exposed their own limitations, the fragility of their friendships, the instability of their trust, and the inevitable collapse of their plan. Their story ended not in triumph, but in courtrooms and prison cells, their names forever tied to an act of cruelty that they themselves could not escape. For Freddy Heineken, the kidnapping was a crucible. He entered it as a powerful executive and emerged as something far more complex, a survivor who had faced his own mortality and found meaning in endurance. He never romanticized his experience, nor did he dwell on revenge. Instead, he used his story as a quiet testament to the strength of the human spirit. He once remarked that those 3 weeks in captivity had taught him more about life than 30 years in business. It was a lesson born of pain, but one that would inspire many who heard it. And for the Netherlands, the kidnapping was a lesson in vulnerability and resilience. It reminded an entire nation that peace is never permanent, that safety must be guarded, and that justice, though sometimes slow, is most powerful when patient and thorough.
The case became a reminder that civilization is not defined by the absence of crime,
but by how it responds to it. Even now, more than 40 years later, the story retains its quiet power. The names of the kidnappers have faded into history, but the image of Freddy Heineken, calm, resolute, alive, remains vivid. His ordeal continues to be recounted not only as a cautionary tale but as a story of endurance, intellect and composure in the face of fear. In the end, the Heineken kidnapping is less about crime than about character. It is a story that begins with greed and ends with reflection. It shows how chaos can be met with courage and how a man, confined in a dark cell, can still find the strength to hope. It reminds us that freedom is fragile, but the will to reclaim it is enduring. As we close this account, imagine once more the streets of Amsterdam in 1983, the cobblestones glistening after a November rain, the city unaware that its quiet rhythm was about to be broken. Then imagine those same streets today, busier, brighter, layered with history, but carrying beneath their surface the memory of those 21 days that changed a nation. The story of Freddy Heineken's kidnapping is, ultimately, the story of the Netherlands itself, resilient, deliberate, unbroken. It remains a testament not only to what was lost, but to what was learned. And as with all stories worth remembering, its echo endures long after the final words are spoken. The Freddy Heineken kidnapping